Chapter 6. At dawn the giant rushed forth to seek his royal enemy, but Aleph was at the wars, so, finding he could not wreak his vengeance on the object of his hatred, he wreaked it on all that belonged or were dear to him. By day he waylaid the king, by night he destroyed the prince's horses and slew his hounds. Soon, Huan's deeds became the terror of the neighborhood, and men feared to walk abroad after sunset, or to traverse the woods alone at any time. When Ulfilas heard of the ravages of the giant, he sent out an armed band to slay him, but they never returned, and that night the ravages of the giant were tenfold what they had been before. Another and another band went out, but Huan's monster strength prevailed over all, and the terror of the country grew greater than ever. Each wound only made the giant more and more savage, and he was forever hunting and being hunted. In dread of snares and pitfalls, he lived a life of suspicion, and walked the earth in fear, for he knew that what men could not compass by strength they would by stratagem. At length, one night he heard the hum of distant music, and songs of triumph floating on the night wind. Angry at the sounds of joy, he seized his spear and sallied from the cave. As he advanced, he saw the light of torches flickering in the plain beneath. He hurried down, and, putting the troop to flight, carried off the favorite wife of the prince, as she was on her way to welcome the victorious Aleph back from a fresh contest. Overjoyed at the rich prize his revenge had at length obtained, he bore his fainting prisoner to his cave. As he secured her to the rock, he gloated over the feast of vengeance he would have on the morrow, and thought to himself how, in the torments of Prince Aleph's darling, he would break Prince Aleph's heart. When he had bound the poor girl fast, he tore the veil from her face, and staggered back, as he discovered in the favorite wife of his enemy his own beautiful and beloved sister Anthe. He stood, with his eyes riveted upon her, still and silent as a statue, and, as he gazed on her pretty face, the love he once had borne her curdled into frantic hate. Bursting with rage, he seized his spear, as if to kill her, but suddenly he threw it from him with a savage chuckle, as if some new cruelty had struck him. Seating himself by the fire, he fixed his eyes on the trembling girl, and, as he ground his teeth, he taunted her with marrying her brother's greatest enemy, calling her by names that made her shudder. Presently he rose, and plucked the jewels, one by one, from her neck and arms, and crushed them on the stone with his heel. Then he paced backwards and forwards in his cave, telling her, with horrid glee, how, on the morrow, he would go forth and seek out her royal husband, and then she should see her love slain before her eyes. Thus the night passed. Early on the morrow the restless Huan rushed forth to seek the prince, and as early the prince rushed forth to seek the giant, for Aleph had sworn an oath that he, single-handed, would avenge and liberate his darling wife. But when the valiant youth saw the giant he had sworn to crush, even he, bold as he was, quailed before the awful appearance of the monster. In vain did Aleph raise his skillful sword to parry off the savage thrust of Huan's spear. In a moment the blade shivered like glass before the giant's blows, and the warrior boy of Asulan, reeled senseless on the sward. Raising the stripling in his arms, Huan hurried back exulting to the cave. Then, binding Aleph face to face with her he had come to save, the giant staunched the wounds of the bleeding boy, for fear his vengeance should be balked. And when he saw the life, that he feared had fled before his vengeance was satisfied, come back and crimson the boy's white lips again, Huan's heart leapt within him for very joy, and he almost shrieked with delight when he beheld his victim shudder as he looked around him. Then, how the monster grinned at the youth, as he ran over and over again the horrors and the torments that he had in store for him and her he loved so fondly. Now he would dance around them, brandishing his spear. Then he would shake his burly fist in Aleph's face, and grind his huge teeth close in front of him, and afterwards he would smite him on the cheek, and spit upon him. And as he saw the girl grow faint for want of drink, and that her lips were parched and cracked with thirst, he fetched the clearest water from the wood, and, showing her how bright it was, drank it off before her longing eyes. As the day drew in he roasted dainty forest meat beside them, so that the savory perfumes of it might madden their hunger, and, seating himself between them, he ate of it, smacking his lips the while, to make them long for it the more. At night, exhausted with rage, he laid himself down, to ponder over fresh and more savage cruelties, for none that he had yet devised seemed savage enough to him, until at last he grew so greedy for their lives that, no longer able to put off the promised treat, he started up and, seizing his spear, moved towards the girl. The sound of his heavy step roused Anthe from her fitful sleep. Waking up, she saw the lifted spear of the giant ready to pierce her breast, and raised her trembling arms to stay the blow. Then Huan beheld in her the same supplicating look, the same uplifted hands, the same appeal for mercy, as when he had seen her stand betwixt him and his father's blows. And the spear dropped harmlessly by his side. Then, as his head fell on his bosom, he felt his former love for her, the only friend his youth had known, gush, like a pent-up stream, into his breast again. And, as his nature softened, the giant's rage dwindled into the cripple's tenderness once more, and all his little sister's kindnesses stole, one after another, back to his mind. Turning from her, lest he should again grow savage, he said within himself, "She is the injured and not the injurer," and moved towards the prince. But the kindly spirit had set in, and the savage was half tamed. Aleph slept, and it was cowardly to kill a sleeping man, and if he woke him up to kill him Anthe must, he felt sure, become poor again, while, if he lived, the prince might yet make her the partner of his riches and kingdom. Then, again, it was not the royal boy who was to blame for the wrongs of the cripple's infancy, but she who had sold his birthright to the king. In the impulse of the moment he snapped their bonds asunder, and bade them fly while he was yet human. But the astounded Aleph, frightened at the strange manner of the giant, stood transfixed to the ground. Giving them a lighted brand, Huan entreated them to be gone before he again became the savage. And, when they had gone, a holy peace, that he had never known before, crept over his heart, and Huan felt calm and happy for the first time in his life. He remembered that, as the cripple, he had at least got some little pity, and thought of what a life of strife he had led since he had been the giant, and, moreover, how the spirit of revenge had made him such a monster, that even his own sister could not recognize him. Falling on his knees, he thanked heaven for the blessed feelings it had given him, and bursting into tears, he prayed to be again the cripple that he before had been. Softened and soothed by his tears, he fell insensibly asleep. And, as the calm moonlight shone upon his face, it showed the peaceful smile upon his lips, as he lay profoundly at rest on his brown bed of leaves. And his dreams were of exceeding comfort to his wearied soul. For he saw a light, as of 1,000 meteors, streaming down from heaven, and golden clouds resting on the green fields and piled one above another, till the topmost was lost in the amazing splendor of the skies. A white-winged host of angels stepped down from cloud to cloud, chanting to the music of their silver lutes a full-throated hymn, in glory of the kindly act. Then, as 1,000 clarions trumpeted his praise, the angels moved back again to heaven, and mounting, beckoned, and bade Huan rise and follow them. Filled with a holy awe, the powerless Huan saw the winged host melt one by one from his sight in the brightness of the light above. As the last one stood on the topmost cloud of all, she looked back again, and once more beckoned him to follow her. As she turned away to leave him forever, the repentant giant started up, and, waking, found himself a dwarf instead of the cripple he had prayed to be. The sun was up, and the jagged sides and roof of the cave sparkled with the light drops, as though studded with myriads of many-colored gems. And the air was cool with the rising dew and fragrant with the breath of the fields, while from the shady thickets of the forest without, floated the soft notes of the hare and the wood pigeon, crying, "Allah! Allah!" Huan, for the first time since his birth, felt at peace with all the world. By his side stood the spirit of kindness, clad in robes of heavenly blue. Her wings were white as May blossoms, and in her bosom nestled a wounded dove. As she moved, there was a perfume of crushed flowers, like bruised spirits breathing blessings for injuries. At first Huan looked with suspicion on the spirit, fancying she had come there not from any love of him, but for some cunning purpose of her own. But she gazed upon him so tenderly from out her tearful eyes, and smiled upon him with so compassionate a smile, that Huan's heart leapt towards her. He would have fallen down and worshipped her, but his bosom was too full to let him speak the blessings he longed to pour upon her, and he felt humbled, as if in the presence of a god. And yet she looked so weak and gentle, as she leant for support upon the cross she bore, that Huan wondered within himself how she could have such power over him. She told him she had heard his prayer, and, pitying him, had changed the unnatural strength of the giant into the exceeding weakness of the dwarf. Then, turning his spear into an olive branch, she bade him go forth her servant, and, by the very might of his weakness, and the magic of its peaceful power, make more glorious conquests than with the weapon of war. But Huan, feeling, as he strove to rise, how feeble and powerless he was, had little faith in what the spirit spake, and feared to take the proffered branch. Seeing him hesitate, she advanced towards him, and strove, by gentle words and wise precepts, to strengthen his purpose. And, among other things, she spake this parable: when man had been sent from the Garden of Eden, to till the ground and live by the sweat of his brow, the angels, sorrowing at his fall, cried, "Surely he will perish, for there is no animal so defenseless as man." Then Pity, looking down from heaven, grieved for him, saying, "Woe to the race of man! For of all God's creatures he is the most helpless in youth, the most imbecile in old age." And Justice, complaining, said, Woe! Woe to his race! For every beast of the field God hath clothed, but man he hath left naked. To every beast of the field he hath given some weapon of defense, but man he hath left unarmed. What shall his strength avail him against the strength of the lion, or his speed against the speed of the wolf? Then Reason rose up and said, Grieve not for the children of the earth, for I will give unto them cunning, so that what they cannot conquer by force they shall compass by stratagem. So Cunning took up her abode among men, and she taught them to fashion the trees of the forest into clubs, wherewith to repel their enemies. But soon man, made wrath by envy, quarrelled with his kind, and, turning the club against his kinsman, slew his younger brother. And when the angels saw the first blow struck, they sorrowed more bitterly than before, saying, We armed him against the beast of the field, but he hath raised the weapon in anger against his kindred. And since man wars with man, we must protect the weak against the strong, so that, blow following blow, the strong, in fear, may cease to oppress the weak. Then Vengeance, spear in hand, came down on earth, and, arming the oppressed against their oppressors, bade them rise and give back tenfold the blows that had been dealt out to them. So the injured slew their injurers. Then the sons of those that had been slain, in their turn, rose up, and, giving back again tenfold the blows, destroyed the slayers and their children too. At length, blow begat blow so fast that tribe warred with tribe, and nation battled with nation. And then peace, frighted, fled back to heaven, leaving strife and ruin to ravage all the earth. The angels heard the clatter of the fray, and took counsel among themselves, saying, Verily, the world will never be at rest. For since man hath learned to meet blow with blow, and to have blood for blood, the circle of destruction must be endless. Oh, for some almighty weapon to stay this universal feud! So they all pondered on the means, and each angel, in her turn, named some engine more frightful than the rest, wherewith to rain such certain death on all around, that men, fearing to face it, should cease to battle. At last, there remained but one to speak, and the angel band turned anxiously to her. You seek some new weapon, she said, to check the wrath of man, some weapon to give back so powerful a blow, that men, however brave, shall lack the courage to stand up against it. There is one so mighty, that those you have named shall be weak as reeds to it, one so certain, that the boldest shall be cowed and the strongest be disarmed by its power. And the angels wondered among themselves, and cried with one voice, Thanks be to God! Thanks be to God! Name it! Name it! Let man, she answered, avenge his wrongs with a kiss, and he shall find it a mightier weapon than the blow. And it was the spirit of kindness that spake the words. Falling on his knees, Huan thanked the spirit for his altered nature, and, taking the proffered branch of peace, vowed never again to raise his hand against his erring brother. As he knelt before her, the spirit blessed him, and while she spake the kindly words, the sun shone full upon her, and, melting in the light, she vanished from the cave. Chapter 7. Olive branch in hand, Huan sallied into the forest. As he looked down the long groves of trees, arched like leafy cloisters high above his head, the holy peacefulness of the place entered his heart, and made him tranquil as the woods around. Charmed with the scene, he paused, as he saw the long black shadows of the stems of the palm and the cedar streaking the green grass, whilst the sunbeams trickled through the leaves above, and sprinkled the earth with an almost liquid light. Then, as he moved on again, the perfume of the wild flowers that he crushed beneath his feet filled the air as with incense, and, remembering how often he had trod that same path before, and seen it only as a place of gloom, Huan wondered how the beauty which encompassed him on every side, hanging on every branch and sparkling on every blade, could have been so long lost to him, and it pained him, as he thought of the days upon days that he had lived in the midst of it, and yet lived almost as blind to it as if, instead of the fair earth and glorious sky, he had been the tenant of a dungeon. And he sat down in the shade, so that the silent beauty of the wood might sink the deeper into his soul. In a moment his heart wandered back to homeland, as he thought of his fallen sister, his long dried up tears streamed forth once more. And he vowed within himself that she should be the first on whom he would try the magic of his power. He would seek Anthe out, and, by his gentle counsels and loving care, win her back to the sunny path she had strayed from. He would talk to her, not of the dark and loathsome past, but of the bright and blessed future, telling her how the tears of repentance were the waters of the fountain of life. Not a harsh word would he say to her, but, remembering how severely heaven had tried her with her beauty, he would pity her for the lovely curse that had been put upon her, and so renew her heart that she, looking at herself through her tears, should hate the gift that once a prince had prized. So he rose up, resolving to go seek his mother, and learn from her where Anthe dwelt. As he journeyed homeward, all the sufferings of his youth rose up one by one to his mind, and, remembering that his father had left him, a cripple, to perish in the woods, he thought how the old man's conscience would smite him when he saw his boy still living, and how bitterly he would reproach himself when he heard that boy forgive him. Suddenly a distant moan murmured through the forest. Huan paused to listen to it. Again and again the groans echoed through the woods, following one another so quickly and so sadly, that Huan, fired with the glory of his mission, hurried in the direction whence they came. As he forced his way past the tangled briars and waded through the long rank grass, the cries grew so loud and deep that Huan knew it was no human being that suffered. He stopped for a moment, fearing to advance. But the sounds were so full of anguish, and so free from rage, that compassion got the better of his fear, and, hurrying on again, at length he reached a low bushy spot, where, stretched among the tall mat rushes, lay a huge black-maned lion, powerless with pain. When Huan saw the monster, and heard its roar, his heart sank within him, and he drew back with fright. Still, it looked at him with so supplicating a look, and cried so sorrowfully, as it licked its swollen paw, that the trembling Huan, gaining courage, stepped cautiously towards it. As he did so, the suffering beast raised the wounded limb as if to ask for aid, and, as Huan stooped timidly to see what ailed it, the lion licked his hand in gratitude. So, shaking off his fear, Huan laid the heavy foot upon his knee, and, pressing the festered ball, drew from out it a thorn, after which he placed herbs upon it, and bound it up with part of his raiment. Then the joy of the poor brute, freed from the anguish of the thorn, knew no limit. Now it crouched before him and fawned at his feet, and now it rolled in the rushes, turning up its white stomach, as if entreating to be fondled by him. And, as Huan patted its dusky sides, it whined out its thanks, till the wood rang again with its noisy gratitude. Huan was moved almost to tears with the affection his compassion had begotten in the brute, and cried, "If the beasts of the field can be thus conquered by kindness, what miracles shall it not work in man?" Chapter 8. As Huan neared the spot where his father's house had stood, a roofless tenement was all that met his sight. The once white walls were here green with mosses, and there blue with mildew, and in and out of the dark openings where the windows had been, the swallows skimmed, twittering to their young. The doorstep, on which he had so often sat, basking in the sun, was almost hidden in the tall rank weeds around it. And, when he entered, he found the half-burnt logs still remained upon the hearth, grey, as if with age, from the lichens and the beard moss that had grown upon them, while the earthen floor was black and sodden with the wet, and dotted with many a fungus. As he looked into the room where his mother was wont to sleep, an owl, scared from its resting place, flew screeching past him, and Huan hurried back to the fields again, for though the place had hardly been a home to him, still he could not help loving the spot for Anthe and the sunshine that had comforted him there. It was in vain that he asked at the nearest cottage for tidings of his sister and his parents, for Ergaster's house was so far away from all other dwellings that the distant neighbors knew little of him. At the woodman's, near the forest, they told him the cripple son had died in the woods, and the pretty daughter had gone away with Prince Aleph, and all they knew was, that shortly afterwards the house had been deserted. At the fisherman's, beside the river, he learnt that, after the children had gone, the laborer and his wife had never prospered, and that Mustache, the traveling barber, had told them, they had come to no good, though what that meant was more than they could say. So Huan resolved to seek his sister at the palace of Prince Aleph, and set out towards the city. And when he had journeyed till he could see the domes of the distant mosques shining in the sun like bubbles of gold, he met a long train of men, most of whom were blind, carrying strings of 1,000 beads, and counting them, as they cried, "There is no deity but God." And Huan, thinking of his sister, grew sad, for he knew it was a sign of mourning. Further on, there came groups of women, with their head and face veils dyed of a deep blue, their hair unbraided, and their hands and arms stained with indigo. Some shrieked aloud their lamentations, while others beat their tambourines, crying, "Alas, for them! Alas, alas, for the city!" And Huan, wondering what their wailing meant, and fearing for his sister, hurried on to the city the quicker. Shortly afterwards he saw advancing bands of pilgrims, clad in coarse woolen garments, of sad colors, reciting passages from the Quran, and carrying with them their grave clothes, which they sprinkled as they went with water from the holy well, in the temple of Mecca. And as they passed Huan they cried out to him, "May no evil befall thee! The angel of death hath smitten the city. Turn thy steps, and fly from the wrath of the Lord." But Huan, fearing the more for Anthe, said unto them, "What shall become of the afflicted, if all turn from them?" And still went on. As he advanced, he met camels and mules, and Mamelukes, and black slaves with furniture, and female slaves, and light bearers, and litters. And after them came King Alpheus himself, attended by his court, and surrounded and followed by multitudes of the frighted merchants and citizens, chanting prayers for the dead, and carrying with them all their wealth, so that the crowd reached to the distant gates of the city. Still, for Anthe's sake, he journeyed on. Now Alpheus, when he saw Huan hastening to the capital, while all others were flying from it, took pity on him, and, thinking him a stranger in their land, sent one of his nobles to warn him that a pestilence had broken out in the city. But the courtier soon returned to Alpheus, and told him his pity was wasted on the man, for that he was a fanatic, and would not listen to his counsels, but had said, "What shall become of the afflicted, if ye all turn from them?" And, as Huan neared the city, he found the mounds of rubbish round its walls covered with the carcasses of horses and mules, and when he had reached the gates, he could not enter, for the funerals that streamed through them. And the dead were of all ranks. Now there passed him the bodies of the poor, in grave clothing of cotton, and carried upon cords interwoven between two poles, and then came those of the merchants and men of wealth, wrapped in cashmere shawls of green and white, some preceded by camels, bearing bread and water, to be given to the hungry at their graves, and others, by buffaloes, to be sacrificed on their tombs, and the flesh distributed in charity, as a peacemaking with God. And when at last the stream of death ceased for a moment, and Huan sought to enter, the gatekeepers warned him back, and bade him fly with the rest. But again he only answered, "What shall become of the afflicted, if all turn from them?" And still moved on, to seek his sister at the palace of the prince. As Huan hurried through the streets, every house he passed gave him some new and ghastly proof of the terrors of the pest that was ravaging the city. Scarce a door but it was painted blue, as a sign of death within, and on those thus colored heavy locks and the seal of the chief magistrate were set, while watchmen, staff in hand, stood in front, so that none might enter or leave the infected dwellings. On the closed shutters of some of these was chalked, 0, misery. While from the windows of others hung placards, on which was written, "We shall all die." Woe! Woe! Over some of the doors that still stood open was inscribed a verse from the Quran, and underneath it, in large letters, "Here giveth the teller of destinies." And, further on, he came to the house of one who sold never-failing herbs and potions to cure the pest. At the door of this one stood a woman, weeping aloud and wringing her hands, as she cried, "Haste! Haste, or my child will die." But a neighboring watchman bade her begone, saying, "The doctor and all were dead within." And, when he reached the market streets, he found the bread shops alone open, for men feared to buy and sell beyond what was required to support life, and even then they would not receive the food from the dealer's hands, but would take it down themselves, nor would the dealer accept the money from their hands, but made them drop it in a jar of vinegar. At each end of the several markets there blazed huge fires, some of pitch and sulfur, and others of benzoin, so that the atmosphere around was filled with the odor of them. And the few people that dared to venture abroad carried scents and perfumes in their hands, and, when they met one another, would cross the road for dread of the contagion. As one hastened through the silk market, a half-naked man, made fanatic by his fears, rushed by, shouting, amidst the terrible stillness, "Oh, great and dreadful God! Repent ye and prepare!" While, in the perfume market, as he passed along, people might be heard in their houses, calling upon God for mercy and confessing their sins aloud, saying, "I have been a murderer. I have been a thief." In the money changers' market there lay a heavy purse in the middle of the road, and at the window of the house opposite sat a Jew, looking steadfastly at it, but fearing for his life to touch it. Presently, as he went along, sorrowing lest he should have come too late to comfort his erring sister, a window was thrown suddenly open, and a woman shrieked above his head, "0 Death! Death! Death!" The blood curdled in Huan's veins, and he sought to enter the house, but the watchman pushed him from the door, saying, "Fool! Wouldst thou die too?" Shortly after this, the door of the house of a rich merchant was burst open, and a grey-headed man, marked all over with the pest, rushed, mad with the fever, from his bed into the street, dancing, and laughing and singing, and making 1,000 antic gestures, and after him ran his weeping wife and screaming children, crying, and calling upon him, for heaven's sake, to come back to them, and entreating those around to help them get him to his bed again. As Huan strove to follow and assist them, the watchman appointed to stop the spreading of the disease held him back, bidding him go to mosque if he wished to comfort the afflicted, for the dervishes were either dead or had fled in fright, and the people cried aloud for consolation. So Huan, hoping Anthe might have sought refuge in the temple, bent his way thither, and when he had reached the porch, he found a crowd gathered outside the building. In the midst of them stood a woman, pointing to the clouds, and, as she did so, she cried, "See yonder, an angel, clothed in white, in his hand is a fiery sword. See! See! He brandishes it over his head, and now points with it to the city." And, though there was nothing there, still the staring people saw it plainly, and some cried, "Yes, there is his sword of fire." And others, "He hath a face of glory." And others, "It is a token of God's anger." But Huan, pitying their superstitious fears, passed on and entered the mosque. It was crowded with the devout and the horseless, with those that came to pray, and those that lived there and slept upon the matting that covered the paved floor, and they all cried, as if with one voice, "Save us, O Lord God the merciful, the compassionate! Save us from this thy just wrath." Now, when Huan heard the people say it was God the merciful, the compassionate, who had sent the pest among them, he could keep his peace no longer, but moved towards the deserted altar. And the people, taking him for a wali, or favorite of God, crowded round him, and kneeling, besought him frantically for his blessing, crying, "Save us! Oh, save us, from this the just wrath of God!" But Huan rebuked them, saying, "Ye know not what ye speak. Ye utter blasphemies instead of prayers." And then he recited the following parable: A certain city was infested by a mighty serpent, the breath of it was poison, and its fangs were the fangs of death. Whomsoever it fastened upon went mad with the venom, and died. So men feared to go abroad lest their enemy should strike them, for so subtle was the serpent, that none knew where it lurked, and it smote men unawares. Even those that barred their doors against it, and set a watch to keep it from them, would wake and find their little ones carried off by it as they slept, while they themselves, ere long, would fall a prey to it, and none were safe, for guard their houses as they would, still the subtle serpent would creep in and destroy all who dwelt there. At last, men, dreading the monster, thought to worship it, saying, "It is no creature of the earth, for its vengeance is terrible, and it moveth from place to place mysteriously as a god." So, thinking it sent from heaven as a scourge for their sins, they prayed the Lord that he would remove the visitation from them, saying, "It cometh from God, and is not born of earth." And so they cried, until scarce a house remained smitten. But at length their eyes were opened, for, after all their prayers and fastings, they found the eggs of the serpent were hatched in the muck heaps that surrounded their own dwellings. And, verily, the poisonous pest sprang not from the all-good God, but from the filth and corruption of the city. Now when the people heard Huan preach these things from the altar, they rose up against him, saying, "He scoffs at the wrath of heaven. If he stay amongst us he will draw down the vengeance of the Lord on our heads as well as his own." So they drove him from the temple. Then Huan hurried on to the palace of Prince Aleph, hoping that he might find his sister there, still unscathed. When he reached it, he found the guards fled and the gates wide open. He clapped his hands, to summon the doorkeeper, but no one came. Again he clapped his hands, till the silent halls echoed with the noise, and still no one came in answer to him. So he entered, and, as he walked along the deserted corridors, not a soul did he see or hear, and in some of the chambers were chests filled with brocades of many-colored silks, and shawls of exceeding value, and drinking cups of the precious metals, and saucers of crystal, and yet no one stayed to guard them. In others were coffers of red gold and white silver, stored with pearls and hyacinths, and precious minerals, while one closet, whose door was open, was filled with suits of Davidson mail, and gilded helmets, and Indian swords, and other instruments of war. And, thou the gates, the coffers, and the chests were open, still no man dared to enter or remain within the palace walls, for fear of the contagion. Wondering within himself what could have befallen his sister, Huan hastened into the thickest of the disease, for he said, "If she be smitten with the pest, I may yet have time to comfort her." Wherever he went he found the sick left to die alone, excepting where some kind friend, who had survived the pest, was tending the last moments of his suffering neighbor, and then the deep scars and pits that the pestilence had left on the face of the survivor, and the ulcerous sores that covered the countenance of the sufferer, told how fearful an affliction it was. In one house he found a man holding in his arms the dead body of his young wife, and so overwhelmed with grief that, though Huan strove to comfort him and lead him thence, he would not listen to him, but, still clinging to the corpse, died heartbroken before the night was out. In another dwelling, a child was brought home from its nurse, who had died of the pest, and yet the tender mother would not refuse to take in the babe, and, though its little head and hands were swollen with the infection, and the purple tokens of death were on it, still she laid it in her bosom and nursed it till it died, and then, kind soul, she died too. When Huan saw these things he wept, and prayed to the blessed spirit of kindness that she would teach him how to stay the ravages of the pestilence. And immediately his eyes were opened, and he saw as in a vision the means whereby to shield those who had yet escaped from it. Full of joy, he hurried back to the mosque once more, and bade those that had fled in terror there, go home again and tend the sick, promising them, if they would put faith in him, he would make them proof against the infection. But many laughed at him, whilst some cried in anger, "It is the scoffer again, that seeketh to oppose the will of God." Others longed, but feared to trust his words. But Huan entreated them so earnestly to have faith in him that the laughing ceased, and men, wavering, looked inquiringly at one another. Here knelt one who had a suffering wife and had come to pray for her deliverance. There stood another who had a stricken son and had fled in fear from him. Here was a girl whose aged father lay prostrate with the pest, and there a woman whose little daughter lay moaning with the malady. These, affliction made more bold and desperate than the rest. And they came forward and sought the magic aid of the dwarf, saying, "We have faith in thy power." So Huan blessed them, and touched each on the right arm, and whosoever came under his touch had a mark left where that touch had been, and on them the pestilence was powerless. When the new miracle was spread abroad, a smile of joy and wonder sat on every man's face. Those who before had crossed over, to avoid each other, when they met in the public ways, now stopped to shake one another by the hand, and cry, "God bless you." And in the narrow market streets the people would throw open their windows, and calling to their neighbors, ask, how they did? And if they had heard the good news. Some, in return, would say, "What good news?" And, when they were answered that the pestilence was stayed, they would cry out, "God be praised." And would weep aloud for joy, blessing them for their glad tidings, saying, they had heard nothing of it. On the morrow, hundreds flocked to the dwarf for the blessing of the touch. And last of all came those who were skilled in medicine, and, though they had scoffed before, they now sought his aid. To these Huan gave the same power as himself, so that the pestilence was stayed, and the whole city rang with the wonder of the deed. But Huan was sad at heart, for among those that flocked to him to be protected he saw not nor could hear of his sister Anthe. Chapter 9. Soon the news reached the king that the havoc of the pestilence had been stayed by the touch of a dwarf, and Alphelas dispatched messengers with presents to the man, commanding him to come and touch him and his. So Huan was conducted to a high hill, at the outskirts of the town, where the king with all his court was encamped. When the dwarf reached the spot, he found large fires of aloes wood and scented resins burning at the base of the mountain, so that the air might be purified ere it reached the king. And the whole multitude were engaged in prayer and fasting, for Alphelas had ordained that, so long as the scourge was on the city, no man should eat or drink from the rising to the setting of the sun. As Huan mounted the sides of the hill, the prayers that the dervishes chanted for the dead ceased, and the priests and nobles came out to meet him, pouring blessings on his head, and beseeching him for the grace of his touch. And, as he gave it to them, one would ask him how this man had fared, and another whether his father was dead or not, while others, who had all their kindred with them, would seek to know how many had been destroyed. When Huan had set the charm upon Alphelas himself, the grateful monarch fell at his feet, and kneeling, bade him name his reward. The dwarf told him he worked not for rewards, still, for the sake of others, there was one that he would ask. And the grateful king cried, "Name it! Name it! Were it half my kingdom, thou shouldst have it." Then Huan demanded his noblest mansion of the king, and the courtiers smiled among themselves, saying, "What can he, a dwarf, want with a royal dwelling?" Huan heard the whisperings of the nobles, and, turning to them, said, "Behold!" And, with a wave of his magic branch, the palace of the king was changed into an hospital for the poor. Then, as the multitude gazed with wonder at the act, and looked down from on high, they beheld the sick, the maimed, and the dying carried from all parts into the royal building. And after these came the doctors, viewing with each other for the honor of tending the poor without fee or reward. When Alphelas saw this, his delight knew no bounds, and, as he wept tears of joy, he cried, "Goon with thy good work! Go on! Choose for the poor another palace, rather than the sick be without a resting place on earth." Then the nobles, fired with the glory of the deed, in their turn, gave each a mansion of his own, until at last almost every ill that troubles man had a palace set aside for the poor. There were gorgeous homes for the mad, the blind, the deaf and the dumb, the mother and the foundling, the widow and the orphan. And the pauper, the vagrant and the wanton, the virtuous old and the sinful young, the veteran soldier and the worn-out sailor, had each their palace too, till the city bristled and glittered with the magnificence of the buildings, and the homes of the suffering poor rivaled in grandeur the homes of the monarch himself. Nor did the charity cease with their own countrymen, for the alien sick had noble homes set apart for them likewise, till the very ships of war that had been created to destroy the people of other lands were given up to save or comfort them in their last moments. And the kindness that had been shown to the children of other nations, the children of other nations in their turn showed to them. For, when the bounty of the kingdom had been exhausted, so that the last hospital stood half raised, and kindness called in vain upon the people to finish the home of their wasting children. A sweet-voiced bird from other lands poured forth her song, and, as the heavens rang with her melody, the building rose and rose, till it grew to be the noblest of all the noble monuments of love and kindness that graced the city. Chapter 10. When Huan returned to the city, multitudes flocked out to meet him, kissing the ground before him, and crying, "Godspeed the worker of good." And, while the king advanced with scarce a follower in his train, Huan could not proceed for the thousands that gathered round him. And, as he heard the blessings of the people raining on his head, he wondered how he, a dwarf, armed with a simple olive branch, should have gained more power over men than Alpheus with all his host. When he was alone in his chamber, he thanked the Holy Spirit of kindness for the change she had wrought in him, and vowed never to rest so long as pain and want were in the world, or man was at enmity with man. So Huan went about, comforting the poor and tending the sick, until each day the people got to love him more and more, and to call him the noble worker of good. Now it chanced one morning, as Huan visited the hospital, he noticed, while all the sufferers he passed had some gentle friend to smooth their pillow and ease their pain, still there was one poor stricken thing whose bedside was deserted, and, though she lay gasping with the fire of the fever, there was no one near to raise the cool cup to her burning lips. Filled with pity for her loneliness, he asked of those around the name and history of the sufferer, but none could tell him who or what she was, for they said she had refused to answer all their questionings. At first Huan thought it might be his sister Anthe, who, deserted in her utmost need, had sought to keep her misery secret from the world. But he remembered that Anthe was the favorite of the prince, and Aleph, he said, would never leave her for whom he had once risked his life, to die alone in such a place. And when Huan sat himself down by her side, and looked at the scarred and riddled face of the girl, his heart beat again, for he felt sure she could not be the pretty Anthe that he sought. But though he rejoiced at first to find another stricken in his sister's place, still, as he looked at the poor maid a second time and read in her sightless eyes how bitterly she had suffered, his heart bled for her, and he vowed that he would be a friend and brother to her in her hour of trouble. Huan tended her so kindly, and spoke to her so gently and sneeringly, that the girl soon got to love and confide in him, so that, as she grew stronger, she would raise herself on her pillow, and turning her sightless eyes towards him, as he sat watching by her side, would tell him of the days when she was happy, and had found a friend in almost all who looked upon her. And she would wonder what those, who used to call her the bright-eyed then, would say if they could see her now. Whereupon, she would vow to herself that henceforth she would be as altered in mind as she was in body, so that none might recognize her. At one time she would thank God for having taken her eyes from her, saying that when she had them, she had used them only to look upon herself, until she had got to think she was the fairest thing in all creation, whereas, now that she had lost them she knew she was the foulest. Then, at another time, she would speak to one of her brother, telling him how her father had so hated him for his deformity, and loved her for her beauty, that he had driven his poor boy from his house, and ruined his weak girl by the vanity of his praises. So Huan, weighing all these things together, soon got to know that the poor, disfigured object at whose bedside he watched, was the once lovely Anthe, who, now that her loveliness had passed away, had been flung aside like a withered flower, and left without a friend to care whether she lived or died. As he consoled her, he drew from her, little by little, the story of all her sufferings. She told him she had fallen the victim of her vanity and Aleph's admiration, for her mother and her father, proud to find their girl loved by a prince, had striven to fan the flame their child's beauty had kindled, leaving her alone with Aleph to listen to his flattery, until at last, she, blinded with the brilliance of the lot he promised should be hers, had left her humble roof for his splendid home. And, when her father found that the girl he had been so proud of, and to increase whose beauty he had squandered all his earnings, had fled so readily from his care, his reason left him, and shortly after her mother died of grief. Then, as she heard Huan weep aloud, she blessed him for his compassion, and went on to tell him that her beauty had been not only her own pest, but the pest of all around. For, to increase the charms she had been cursed with, she had asked of the prince, when he begged her to name some precious gift by which he might show the magnitude of his love for her, a shawl of many colors from the far Indies, made of the fine wool of the goat of Tibet, and interwoven with red gold, and how in that shawl the pestilence had been brought into the city, and she deprived by it of the very charms it was intended to enhance, so that Alepht's love had turned to fear, and he had cast her from him, cursing her as a witch. And when she had told the wretched tale, Huan, as he wept, confessed to his sister who he was, and consoled her, saying, he would be ever near to guide and protect her in her darksome way, and, now that she was blind, she should look at the world with his eyes, and find in it beauties that she had never seen before. Then, as she ran her fingers over his features, she blessed him, as she kissed his hand again and again, thanking heaven for the hard lesson it had taught her. As Anthe's health came slowly back again, Huan would find her sometimes sorrowing for the beauty whose loss had deprived her of Aleph's love. And then her brother, seeing her waver, would seek to console and strengthen her in the purpose of her new life, telling her how all outward beauty was a gorgeous cheat, unless the inner part were beauteous too, and how the love which mere external excellence begat, was false and hollow as the beauty which begat it. But that which moved the frail one most, was the story he told her of what befell the pretty poppy. In a field of ripening corn there grew a poppy, and while the homely corn, dressed in its suit of sober drab, was rough and plain, the poppy put forth her pretty crimson leaves and blossomed into beauty. And, as the thriving corn grew tanned in the sun, increasing in wealth each day, the silly poppy feared to show her face, lest the scorching rays should take the color from her damask cheeks. And, when the autumn came, the corn, that had gathered only goodness in the summer of its days, bowed down its head, for the fuller its head became, the humbler it grew. But the gaudy poppy, living not for others, and thinking only of herself, was, in her prime, as empty-headed and proud of her fine leaves as in the springtime of her life, so that every lark that carolled above the field she thought sang only the praises of her charms, flattering herself that, while she was there, no one would deign to look with favor on the corn. But, when the reapers came, they passed the vain poppy by, as a showy, useless thing, leaving her for others less wise than themselves to pluck for her fickle beauty. Whereas, they took the corn to their arms, and bearing it home with feasting, treasured it up, calling it the life of their life, for, while they disregarded the rudeness of its outward form, they prized it tenfold for its inner worth. But one weak, giddy youth, smitten with the rosy charms of the poppy, took her for her pretty looks, and pressed her to his lips, till she wept for very love of him. Then, as he kissed away her tears, the poison of her beauty sank deep into his soul, and laying himself down beside her, he slept away the days in helpless sloth, until at last, when all her pretty leaves dropped one by one away, and laid bare the poison that her loveliness had hidden, he shook off his dream, and flung the withered beauty from him as a thing for men to trample underfoot.